This is Land of Havilah, Psalm 110. It's 7 verses, and it's a barn burner, a thriller. The first line's especially familiar because the New Testament quotes it 5 times. Matthew 22:44, Mark 12:36, Luke 20:42, Acts 2:34, and Hebrews 1:13. This psalm's difficult to comprehend on first reading, so we'll explain some up front, then read it and explain some more. The overall flow of the psalm in the 7 verses of it is that as we speak, Jesus sits at the right hand of the Father. He's waiting for the appointed time to return to the earth. It'll be his second coming, we sometimes call it. When it comes, it'll be in power and glory, his saints with him and all the holy angels with him, according to this psalm and according to Matthew 24:30 and 1 Thessalonians 3:13 and Revelation 19:14. He'll sit on the throne of his glory and establish the visible and literal kingdom of God on earth, according to this psalm and Matthew 19:28 and Revelation 19:15. His people will reign with him, 2 Timothy 2:12 and Revelation 20, verse 6. It'll be a bloody return, as described in this psalm and in Revelation 19:15 and Isaiah 63, 1-6. He'll crush his enemies. He'll heap up dead bodies, as the psalm says. So it's a psalm about the second coming. But he won't be just king when he comes. He's priest forever, according to the order of Melchizedek in the psalm. Melchizedek, who appeared in Genesis 14, and there's commentary of him in Hebrews chapters 5-7. Melchizedek was without father or mother. There was no mention of his genealogy or nationality in Genesis, as there is of the rest of the biblical characters. So we might say, as the writer of Hebrews said, that Melchizedek, having no father or mother, was without beginning or end. He has no birth or death as far as what's written. And he was greater than Abraham, as testified by the fact that Abraham gave tithes to him. A lesser person tithes to the greater person, as the writer of Hebrews points out. So this Melchizedek was particularly magnificent, being greater than Abraham. Melchizedek's name translates to King of Righteousness and King of Peace. All these facts about Melchizedek point to Jesus. Not that Melchizedek in the book of Genesis was necessarily and exactly Jesus, but he might have been. It seems to your narrator there's a very good chance Melchizedek was Jesus. Anyway, the psalm will point out in verse 4 that God has appointed this Lord who's at his right hand, to be high priest forever according to the order of Melchizedek. That Lord is Jesus, according to Hebrews 6:20, at the Father's right hand, appointed high priest forever. Because Jesus is King of Righteousness, the blood he sheds when he returns will be completely justified. And because he's King of Peace, the war he wages when he returns, the blood he sheds, the dead bodies he piles up, will be all in the interest of peace. He'll establish peace, justice, and righteousness through war when he returns, as the psalm describes. Now, reading the psalm, a psalm by David. Yahweh says to my Lord, sit at my right hand until I make your enemies your footstool for your feet. Yahweh will send out the rod of your strength out of Zion. Rule among your enemies. Your people offer themselves willingly in the day of your power, in holy array. Out of the womb of the morning you have the dew of your youth. Yahweh has sworn and will not change his mind. You are a priest forever in the order of Melchizedek. The Lord is at your right hand. He will crush kings in the day of his wrath. He'll judge among the nations. He'll heap up dead bodies. He'll crush the ruler of the whole earth. He'll drink of the brook on the way. Therefore he'll lift up his head. Comment, that's the end of the psalm. In verse 1, Yahweh says to my Lord, sit at my right hand until I make your enemies your footstool for your feet. Daniel 7 verses 13 and 14 clear this up completely. Daniel saw in a dream a person who looked like a man coming upward through the clouds of the sky into heaven. As we know, the disciples watched Jesus ascend from the earth into the clouds, Acts 1:9. They lost sight of him in the clouds, which is where Daniel's vision picks up. Daniel saw Jesus break through the top side of the clouds and enter heaven. Daniel goes on to say that in his vision, when this person arrived in heaven, quote, He came even to the Ancient of Days, and they brought him near before him, end quote. This was angels bringing Jesus near the Father. Then in Daniel's vision, speaking of this person being presented to the Father, dominion was given him, and glory, and a kingdom, that all the peoples, nations, and languages should serve him. His dominion is an everlasting dominion which will not pass away, and his kingdom that which will not be destroyed, end quote. In other words, after Jesus died, rose from the grave, and ascended to the Father made him king of all peoples, nations, and languages to rule over the earth, sitting at the Father's right hand. But the thing is, Jesus still had enemies on the earth. There were usurpers in his worldwide kingdom. In fact, some of them had just killed him, and the spiritual children of those usurpers live on to this day in the earth. Men still blaspheme him, rebel against him, ignore his sovereignty, do whatever they please, insult him, all seemingly without repercussion. There's no repercussion, at least not full repercussion yet, because of verse 1 of the psalm, that there's a planned delay until Jesus will return in power. Quote, Yahweh said to my Lord, sit at my right hand until I make your enemies a footstool for your feet, meaning Jesus won't impose himself on his enemies right now, not fully, until the appointed time. By the way, when David called the Lord sitting at Yahweh's right hand, my Lord, in verse 1, he was calling Jesus Lord. Knowing that key detail, it's obvious that the rest of the psalm isn't about David crushing his enemies or about being a priest according to the order of Melchizedek, but about his Lord crushing his enemies and being priest. Ever since creation, God's enemies have been free to rebel against him. But on a day the Father has appointed, Acts 1, 6 and 7, Jesus will arise from the right hand of the Father and return to the earth. The return will be in power and glory with his saints and holy angels with him. He'll come to crush his enemies, as the psalm goes on to describe. Thenceforth he'll rule on the earth and establish peace and righteousness on it, which is the subject of more prophecy than probably any other topic, that God will establish his literal kingdom on earth. If all we had was this one psalm to understand it, there'd be too much mystery to figure it out. So thankfully we have revelation upon revelation to fill in the blanks on the subject of Jesus being king, returning, crushing his enemies, and establishing his reign on earth. We call his return in power and glory on that day the second coming, but the Bible doesn't call it that because he's ever present. For example, he said, I'll be with you always, even to the end of the age, Matthew 28:20. And he appeared to Paul and others since he left. Before he was born to Mary and Joseph, he appeared to Abraham in Genesis chapter 18. So to call Jesus' return in power and glory his second coming wouldn't be accurate. But when we define that term, what we mean by second coming, we can use it, and we all know what we mean. In short, this is a prophecy of Jesus' second coming written 1,000 years before he was born to Joseph and Mary. And the clock's still ticking. It's now been 3,000 years since this psalm, and we still expect him to come. According to your narrator's interpretation of prophecy, the return won't happen until the man called Antichrist is revealed first, 2 Thessalonians 2:3. The man called Antichrist will rule the earth during what's called the Great Tribulation, at the end of which, on the appointed day, Jesus will return. He'll come in power and glory with his holy angels and saints, crush his opposition, and set up his kingdom. In verse 3 of the psalm, your people offer themselves willingly in the day of your power, end quote. The day of his power is the day he returns. His saints will participate with him in the return. And that they'll offer themselves willingly is an understatement. They'll be enthusiastic to the extreme to return with him. In the book of Revelation, the martyrs in heaven cried with a loud voice, How long, Master, holy and true, until you judge and avenge our blood on those who dwell on the earth, Revelation 6:10. Those martyrs and all the saints will be more than willing to offer themselves in the day of his power. They'll be more than ready for the Lord to accomplish vengeance for himself and for them. In verse 4 of the psalm, Yahweh has sworn and will not change his mind. You are a priest forever in the order of Melchizedek. The you there is singular in Hebrew, Yahweh speaking to one person, the Lord at his right hand. Jesus is priest forever. God will not change his mind about it. He's the forever priest. In verses 5 through 7, the returning Lord will crush kings in the day of his wrath, judge among the nations, and heap up dead bodies. He'll drink the blood of the brook, which means there'll be so much blood flowing on that day it'll flow into the brooks. Jesus will drink it, meaning he'll have no remorse or regret about waging that war. It'll be a celebratory war of retribution that was a long time coming. Many would say overdue, but it's exactly in Yahweh's timing. The closing line is, therefore he will lift up his head. There'll be no hanging of Jesus' head as there was on the cross when he gave up the Spirit. He'll lift up his head in triumph when he returns, in satisfaction that he's established justice and vengeance after all this time for himself and for his people. Just a couple of loose ends in verse 3, speaking of the returning Lord, quote, out of the womb of the morning you have the dew of your youth, end quote. This means when Jesus returns, he won't be feeling old, bruised, and battered. He'll be fresh as a daisy, feeling young, completely recuperated from his suffering, not like a tired old man, ready for the dawn of a new day on the earth. In verse 2, Yahweh will send the rod of his strength out of Zion. Jesus is the rod of Yahweh's strength. Yahweh will show his strength through the returning Lord. The Lord came in peace and weakness the first time, and men took advantage of him, so this time it'll be in Yahweh's strength. In verse 4, the returning Lord will crush the ruler of the whole earth. The ruler of the whole earth is Satan. Satan's the god of this world, 2 Corinthians 4:4. Jesus will crush him, Revelation 20, verses 1 to 3. That crushing will be an imprisonment for 1,000 years when he returns, after which Satan will be thrown into the lake of fire, Revelation 20, verse 10. The ruler of the whole earth under Satan at the time of the return will be the man Antichrist, and Jesus will crush him too, Revelation 19, 19 to 21. Psalm 111 is next.